Hard to fathom. A man with a gun taking a bigger gun away from someone who'd stolen it from a police cruiser that had been set on fire, like a bad cowboy movie. A man taking a full swing with a baseball bat to the head of a police officer. In the charging documents for 19-year-old Jacob Greenberg, a friend texted to him, "Very proud of you." Greenberg texted back, "Appreciate it. I'm proud too. He. Wish he didn't have a helmet on. LOL. A crazed man with a flaming pole running towards a police car and driving the pole into the window of the car. The car burned. The officer escaped barely, but he easily could have been killed. People trying to cement shut the back door of the East Precinct and then lighting the front of the building on fire in hopes of trapping police inside to die. And peaceful protests about police violence taken over at night by those deliberately provoking police violence. When Seattle needed leadership the most, the city council, far from being a calming agent, threw gasoline on the fire.
I've also spent more than 15 years thinking that this is something that we could reform, that we didn't need to throw the baby out with the bathwater. But I am now convinced that that is not the course of action we need to take.
It is the institution of policing itself that must be dismantled.
Now is the time to divest from the police department.
City Attorney Pete Holmes announced that he wouldn't file charges against protesters, even when they were arrested for things like obstruction, failure to disperse, and property damage. For the most part, he kept his word. It was a green light.
It is becoming a very hostile place for the police in Seattle, and they see that, experience that, and feel that, of course, on the streets. But I think the most challenging thing for them is that they see that many of those signals are also coming from our elected officials.
Calls to the police for the most serious criminal offenses have increased dramatically in the last decade. There has been a 50% increase in Priority 1 calls, life-threatening emergencies, crimes against people. There's been a 47% increase in assault calls, a 47% increase in burglary calls, an 80% increase in domestic violence calls. The murder rate in 2020 has doubled its average over the last 10 years. The need for policing in a civilized society is real. In Seattle, it's all too real. And yet there are those who don't seem to understand or care what it is they actually do. And during the debate on the police department's budget, Councilmember Tammy Morales told us this.
Most of the 911 calls that are made are, in fact, not for crimes, but for nuisance calls and things like that.
Nuisance calls and things like that. The data disagrees.
Just not true. Not true. Look at the data. The data is clear. People call Seattle Police Department for service 225,000 times a year for these top high priority. And the police come out on patrol and engage to prevent or disrupt or make arrests for assaults, burglaries, other things, another 50,000 times. So 286,000 times a year, you have a priority 1, 2, or 3 response. Only 6% or less of all calls that the police are getting are for what I would think of as nuisance matters.
Councilmember Kashama Sawant, who famously flung the doors of City Hall open to protesters, wants you to believe that law enforcement are little more than a band of tormentors, wandering around looking for homeless people and people of color to hassle.
Reducing the funding and therefore the size of the police department would mean that the police would not have the resources to continue to overstaff and abuse Black Lives Matter protests, and not to mention the chronic targeting they do of homeless neighbors. They would have less time to harass communities of color as a whole.
Victoria Beach, the chair of the African American Community Advisory Council to the Seattle Police Department, doesn't look at it that way.
Our city has basically been destroyed, and it's a free-for-all. And the bad part is City Council is allowing it. I feel like they're leading it. They're leading the group in destroying our city.
Councilmember Teresa Mosqueda seemed to think that police are stupidly wasting time by showing up at medical calls.
The simple act of having a registered nurse at the 911 call center could help
address many of the calls that they receive and reduce the need for many of the patrol officers to be in the field.
Which was, of course, a fundamental misunderstanding of how 911 works.
If somebody calls 911 and they have a medical emergency, that call will be routed from the police dispatchers, which are the master routers, over to the fire department dispatch system. Having a nurse at the police dispatch for police, it doesn't even make sense.
There was a blind spot at City Hall when it comes to policing in Seattle, and it's caused us to wildly oversteer in the direction of anarchy. That blind spot has produced decision-making that we'll be paying for a long, long time. It's almost hard to fathom now, like some kind of twisted urban legend, but it really did happen. The city of Seattle really did surrender a police precinct and 6 blocks of businesses and homes to a mob. Seattle walked away, abandoned the rule of law, abandoned the people that lived there and worked there, quit on them.
Leaving the precinct was not my decision.
America looked on, confused.
Any criminal knows they can come in here, do anything short of life-threatening, and get away with it.
Defiantly, infamously, Seattle smirked and doubled down.
How long do you think Seattle in those few blocks looks like this?
I don't know. We could have the summer of love.
Well, tell that to the police who was supposed to be in that precinct.
The summer of love went to hell.
Before that, city council members showed up at the barricade on June 6th during an intense week of clashes between protesters and police to celebrate this really cool thing that was happening. Dan Strauss, Lisa Herbold, Andrew Lewis, and Teresa Mosqueda showed up and took a selfie. 2 days later, police boarded up their precinct and walked away. But there were real people in that place, not just the ones drawing with chalk and blowing bubbles, but people running businesses, people afraid for their lives.
I didn't see a police one. I mean, I'm pretty shook up.
Then the guns started showing up, and when the sun went down, a meanness crept in, and hell started breaking loose.
Step back if you are not part of security!
Now there were guards, self-appointed peacekeepers, and every night, terror.
Medics, calling for medics up there.
It was a City Hall-sanctioned, real-life, Lord of the Flies scenario. Kids find themselves in the wrong places at the wrong times. For Lorenzo Anderson, a 19-year-old special needs kid who was at CHOP in the early morning hours of June 20th, it was a death sentence.
No police. When do Seattle, Tacoma, any place in America don't have no police that's coming? That's who we count on. That's who we look up to. No matter what's going on, they do some up, but at the end of the day, them are the first people that we need to call to de-escalate something happening.
Surveillance video showed an 18-year-old pull a gun out of his pocket and pointed at Lorenzo. Lorenzo tried running away but fell down and was shot repeatedly.
What's going on? Put your guns down!
And here's the thing. When police responded, they were met by what they called an aggressive and volatile crowd. They couldn't clear the area. First responders couldn't or wouldn't go inside the CHOP zone to get to the body. Lorenzo lay there bleeding.
But when they signed oath, they knew everything could have been a hostile environment from get-go. You been playing hero. Play hero for him. He needed them. I needed them. I am torn apart behind son. You understand this? I'm torn.
Somebody finally drove him to the hospital, where he died, just 1 day after he graduated from an alternative high school. Lorenzo's mother, Donita Sinclair, is represented by Mark Lindquist and the Herman Law Group. She is suing Seattle for creating and allowing a dangerous situation and for failing to protect and medically assist her son.
What have they said to you?
I haven't heard from them.
You haven't heard from...
Never.
from the city of Seattle.
This the best man got going. Never heard from them.
Where was Seattle that night and that month? Where were the people who were charged with protecting a city and its citizens? Where were the adults on June 20th when a chunk of Seattle was abandoned and so was a 19-year-old kid bleeding on the ground? In 8 days, there were 5 shootings in the CHOP area, with 6 victims. There was a rape and various assaults and beatings and buildings set on fire. On June 29th, a 16-year-old boy named Antonio Mays Jr. was shot and killed.
2 African-American men dead at a place where they claim to be working for Black Lives Matter, but they're gone. They're dead now. And we've had multiple other incidents: assaults, rape, robbery, and shootings. And so I can